Welcome to our feature production, Conservative Authors in Canada. I'm Christine Douglas-Williams. To each of these diverse authors that you will meet today, conservatism or classic liberalism is both political theory and a set of principles to live by in an open society such as ours. Without conservative institutions and conservative voices, we really do not have a fully functioning liberal democracy, according to Howard Rodberg, founding president of Mantua Books. So we thank him for making today happen. Mantua Books does the service of providing a strong conservative voice in Canada. You will not hear politically correct views today. Instead, you will hear open, honest, and critical voices that are often missing or not invited to participate in debates and discussions in our public forums. To explain a bit about the concept of classical liberalism as sourced in our discussion today, it emerged in the 19th century and advocated that every individual has the rights to life, liberty, and property. The function of government is to protect these rights based on natural law as proposed by the great political philosopher John Locke. In the economic realm, classical liberals advocate free market economy. In the political and social realms, classical liberals have been the greatest advocates of limited government, free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and so on. The authors today posit that the principles of classical liberalism are not lost. Instead, they now find home chiefly among conservatives. Here, partisanship enters the equation, and those committed to the principles of classical liberalism now tend to support political parties like the Republican Party in the United States and the Conservative Party in Canada. Other characteristics of conservatives include support for traditional values of faith and family, and opposition to moral and cultural relativism, to political correctness, and to the public policy based on the questionable idea of multiculturalism that proposes all cultures are equal. Multiculturalism has become a liberal mantra in the view of our authors, even though in Canada, both liberals and conservatives, Pierre Trudeau and Brian Mulroney, respectively, were responsible for enshrining multiculturalism in the Canadian Constitution. We will be examining the merits of the various political dogmas of today. We will be hearing from our authors on whether they see elements of classical liberalism still present in left liberals. If so, then why do the latter so often shun free and open debate with conservatives? Why do they devote ongoing strenuous efforts to censor conservatives? And why the politically correct obsession with not offending certain groups in our society? Even university students are learning they have a right not to be offended when their predispositions are subjected to scrutiny, or to be safe from what they call microaggressions, all of which is a negation of our tradition of freedom of expression. Rather than engage in stimulating debate, our university students are being provided with safe spaces on their campuses to comfort them from an onslaught of intellectual inquiry that may be at odds with their politically correct values. Before meeting our fine authors today, common among them is the belief that preserving the best of traditional values means fighting what is called postmodernism, that is rife with moral and cultural relativism. Howard Rodberg is founding president of Mantua Books. He has also authored 4 books, including Tolerism, The Ideology Revealed, where he states that the left has been overcome with the warped ideology of tolerance. They tolerate Islamists and the most non-liberal and intolerant peoples. His recent sequel is entitled The Ideological Path to Submission, and What We Can Do About It.
My name is Howard Rodberg. I'm an author, having written 4 books on political culture, values, and ideologies, and I am the founding president of Mantua Books. Well, I started as a lawyer, but before I became a lawyer, I have a degree in history as well as law. When I studied history, I was very interested in the history of ideologies, cultures, values, and especially of the various ideologies that end in ISM, from Nazism to racism to socialism. And as a son of a survivor of Auschwitz, I always had a somewhat different interest and ideology and set of concerns than some of my peers. As I practiced law, I was doing a lot of development work, And I could see there were certain ways that we could contribute to our society by creating affordable rental housing for low-income working people. So eventually I got so interested in that, I sold my law practice and devoted myself to what I saw as a Jewish value of social justice. And we bought old factories, warehouses, even the old fire headquarters building in Kitchener, and using some federal government programs that existed, we set about creating affordable rental housing for low-income working people. So I felt that I was progressive, and I had an interesting talk, for example, with a city councillor in one of the cities in southern Ontario, and I tried to give him some of my writings about how we can have both affordable rental housing and affordable owned housing. And I happened to mention to him that I did some writing and I wrote for Front Page magazine. And he said, "Front Page magazine? You mean the one that's done by the David Horowitz Freedom Center?" And he never talked to me again. So in other words, my conservative values trumped my abilities as an expert in affordable housing and progressive social policies. I realized after a while of doing some writing that the market for my own writing was very restricted, that so many newspapers and magazines had adopted a rather left-wing version of liberalism, so that one couldn't speak out. Liberalism, in my view, had always been a kind of middle-of-the-road loyalty to liberal values, freedom, justice, human rights. The people we used to call classical liberals are today, by reason of the left liberals moving leftward, are today taking the position of classical liberals and conservatives. So we've taken it as a responsibility of our publishing house is to promote conservatives who base themselves on classic liberal values. There are conservatives, of course, who've moved rightward to be populist, and even in European settings to be nativist and very radical. But talking about our conservatives based on classic liberal values, we think that the promotion of classical liberal values will prevent the kind of right-wing rude populism that one can see. So to strengthen classic liberalism, we have moderate conservative authors but basing themselves on the principles of classic liberalism. I began to see that people on the left were, in response to various discussions about our political situation, they were relying on their tolerance as being a main value in our society. I began to see that the ultimate consequence of adopting these was that we were submitting, in terms of our values and our freedoms, to nasty people who don't accept those values, don't accept those freedoms. So I began to study very carefully the differences in the Muslim world between those who are okay with coming to our countries and prioritizing our liberal values, and those who, whether they're in their own countries or they're moving to Europe or North America, want to have us submit to their worldview and their values and their actions. We call them the Islamists, following the political ideology of Islamism that is based on Islam, but has taken it in a direction where certain negative values of the 6th and 7th century of violent conquest, Sharia law, terrible actions towards women, children, gays, are all emphasized and are the basis of terrorist actions. These Islamists were behind a policy of terrorism, as was Saudi Arabia, and the terrorism was something like a cultural Stockholm syndrome, where people who are taken hostage who should have hated the people who took them hostage, began to listen to their views and accept their views, and in many cases fall in love with their captors. And we were seeing journalists captured as hostages by Islamists and coming out saying how wonderful their captors really were. So when you submit and give special privileges, and when you use the word Islamophobia, like motion M103, Islamophobia is a nonsense term. A phobia is an irrational fear. And to the extent that we fear Islamists, not the ordinary Muslims who go about their business and their view of Islam is as an Abrahamic religion where it's between man and God to become a better person. But those Muslims who either take active steps against our freedoms or tolerate or assist, but the idea that we have to be so tolerant and loving towards people that that from another religion, which is fine, but you have to distinguish between Islam and Islamism. And those who follow Islamism have declared war on the West. The idea that we should allow them in our government and give them special privileges and agree to this idea of Islamophobia when the term should be Islamist phobia. And until we take back and assert our values, and until we say we're going to fight back in this war, we're going to deport you if you're going to take actions against our gays or against our women or against our Jews or against our Christians. The world has gone crazy. There's genocide happening, and our media is with the killers and not the victims. I have written about Israel. I wrote a novel about Israel called The Second Catastrophe, and I spent a lot of time there during the Second Intifada. And I could see that the Islamists, the whole Muslim world, has declared war on Israel. I can see that the whole Muslim world does not give any rights to Jews. I can't go to Indonesia. I can't go to Saudi Arabia. Syria today is in a state of war against Israel. But my books go into a lot of detail about the no-go zones and what's happening in Sweden. They opened the gate first to as many Syrians as could come in. So if I understand, and based on the situation, what happened to the Jews in France in the last few years, if I understand that they're bringing in immigrants who are anti-Semitic and hate me, then I think my government has declared war on me. So our authors really, to sum up, have to educate people so that they understand what is actually happening with our values, with the ideologies that we're accepting or not accepting. And it's a lot of work, but we welcome that work because it's so important for our children and our grandchildren. The basic problem we have as a small publishing company doing books by conservative authors is that the media is a bit lost. So we have problems giving lectures, we have problems getting our books reviewed by other than conservative websites. On the bright side, that the media isn't the same anymore. The internet has changed everything. So if Toronto Star and Globe and Mail don't want to review our books, or the New York Times doesn't want to review our books, we have many websites that are re-examining our fundamental freedoms and how we can promote them, and they're doing reviews. So not only does the internet give us a wider market, it gives us a new kind of market, and I feel that the future, as what is happening in Europe spreads to Canada and the United States, the kind of tolerance of jihadist violence and the tendency to submit to it. If I didn't have that optimism, I wouldn't spend the time writing these books. So I believe that while we're growing slowly, I think we have some great people, and I believe that we can only be ignored for so long.
Diane Weber-Biederman is a multi-faith endorsed, hospital-trained chaplain and author. Her book, Back to the Ethic, Reclaiming Western Values, where she argues that it is time to go back to the founding ethic of Western culture and reclaim our foundational Judeo-Christian Western values.
My name is Diane Weber Biederman. I'm the author of Back to the Ethic, Reclaiming Western Values. I am a multi-faith endorsed chaplain. I did my residency at Toronto Hospital, which is the largest hospital in Canada, and Toronto is the most diverse city in the world, so I'm very proud of that designation. I started writing in 2010 about mental illness because I have one, and I'm a mental health advocate. And as I was writing and paying attention more and more to current events, I became drawn into politics, ethics, because of my background in religion, and I also wrote about religion and spirituality. And I find that writing just seems to take off, that you start to follow a path, and the exciting thing is you really don't know where it's going to take you. Every culture has an underlying ethic that makes laws possible. What we're losing fact or understanding of is democracy is firmly rooted in what I call ethical monotheism, or what we call today the Judeo-Christian ethic. This is an extraordinary, miraculous ethic that came into world consciousness 3,500 years ago, when thousands of Israelites were released from slavery, brought into a desert. And the first thing you would think that these people would say is they want revenge, because they were living at a time of tribalism and honor-shame culture. And they are told, whether you believe in God or not, no, you will care for the other, because at some point in your past, these people cared for you. And that is a miraculous statement. At the same time, these people were told something else that was different from everyone else. All life is sacred. All people are born with equal intrinsic value. That's still unheard of in 60% of the world today. If you start off that all people have equal intrinsic value, then your laws make it possible for people to say, you're not treating me fairly. We've come to accept the idea that all cultures are equal. Franz Boas suggested that in the early 1900s. They're not. They're different, but not necessarily equal. And in our desire to be tolerant, inclusive, accommodating, and as Prime Minister Trudeau tells us, diverse, we are allowing ourselves to be open to ideas that are diametrically opposed to our ethical system. And when we do that, my fear is we will commit suicide by democracy. We will be so open to everybody's values that we will lose our values, which are difficult to keep because, again, you have to have free will. You have to be able to make decisions. You have to be able to say, this is right and this is wrong. In a world where you believe all cultures are equal, you would accept everybody as equal. Well, we don't believe in the caste system, which exists in India. We would never accept here in Canada the idea that some people are born into such a low caste that they're to be just thrown away. In the same way that we will no longer accept demeaning gay people. We would never allow people to come into this country and say to us, gay people have no right to live. If you believe all cultures are equal, then you have to accept all that. The minute you say, no, I don't agree with that, you've moved from that cultural relativism to the cultural absolutism of the Judeo-Christian ethic. The other thing that a lot of conservative writers try to point out is that the Judeo-Christian ethic, and by the way, you don't have to be Jewish, Christian, or religious at all. It is open to all people of all races, colors, creeds, religions, and ethnic backgrounds. It is an ethic that makes it possible for people to say, I'm not being treated fairly. This is the ethic that President Lincoln referred to for the Emancipation Proclamation. He used that ethic to say, you can't treat black people differently. The gay community in the West was able to say, you must treat me equally well. You cannot do that in China, Russia, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, a lot of Africa, and all 50+ Muslim majority countries. We have done a terrible job of teaching our children the stories that are common to our value system. When I went to school, we read the Bible every day. It wasn't to be a Christian or not a Christian. It is the stories in the Bible that teach us how to be compassionate people in a compassionate society. Now, I know a lot of people say, well, there are terrible things written in the Bible. The purpose of this Bible was to take us from that group of people in the desert who could not take care of themselves into a land where they had laws that made everybody equal. We're not teaching our children that the ethic is perfect. People are imperfect, and our job is to try to get better at implementing this extraordinary, miraculous, still revolutionary ethic. And by having this idea, it's all about you and how you feel take over, we are going backward in time, back to tribalism. We have got such identity politics today that groups are vying to win the prize in victimology. Whereas 3,500 years ago, when the Jewish people came into the desert, they were told right away, victimology is not appropriate. You must go forward with a belief in goodness and kindness and caring for the other. So to me, when we allow people to come here and say to us, but that's democracy, everything is equal. No, all people are born with equal intrinsic value, and everything we do must be faced on that, directed that way, and also something else we've lost. All life is sacred. If we start with that, our decision making is much different than if we don't believe that all life is sacred. We have to be very careful where we are today that we don't slide into fascism. And I'd like to explain the science actually behind it. So let's go back to the Bible, to the story of Moses in the desert with thousands of people, and they're there for 40 years. Now, you're walking from Egypt today to Jordan of today to Israel today. This does not take 40 years for the slowest person. But the reason it took so long is that after the people had been enslaved for 400 years, they're finally free. And what's the first thing they complain about? Who's going to take care of me? Where am I going to get food? And they start thinking, you know, it wasn't so bad. The food wasn't so bad. The work wasn't so bad. You know, maybe it was better than what we have now. We are innately afraid of the unknown and of the future. So Moses, along with God, took a look. This is a story, everyone. You don't have to believe in God. And realized the only way that these people could go into a world with this brand new, extraordinary ethic, totally different from the honor-shame cultures around them, was that anyone who had been raised, bathed, and swaddled in slavery had to die first, and a new generation had to come forward. Why? Because it takes so little to give up your freedom, because that is our fallback position. And so we slowly give up our freedom to the state. There's a lot of discussion now, how much should be state, individual rights, state rights, federal rights. It's because human beings, out of fear of the unknown, will latch on to the most recent guru. That's why we have cults. For people who sometimes feel they're drowning because no one is listening, we don't have to complete the task in this life, but we cannot avoid being part of it. You must listen to your voice, you must carry on, and this is what I hold dear for me to keep me going. Silence is collusion. If you do not speak up, you are agreeing with the path that you are being taken down that you don't agree with. You must have the courage to speak and to write and to never give up, because the ethic that underpins democracy is the very best ethic we have today. And I'd like to end this, if I could. I'm going to read a quote by columnist George Jonas, the late George Jonas, and this is in my book. He wrote, "Do not let Western civilization, the best and most humane form of civilization developed by mankind, perish by default."
Professor Paul Merkley has authored 7 books and will shed light on how some left liberal voices within Christianity demonize Jews, have abandoned Jewish Zionism, and instead adhere themselves to the values of replacement theology in a twisted brand of liberation theology.
My name is Paul Merkley. I'm a retired professor of history from Carleton University. The interest in Israel as a scholar began in a moment of time. In 1979, I noticed outside the office of the Dean of Arts a notice inviting people to apply for an exchange of scholarship to Jerusalem, to Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And I thought, wouldn't that be wonderful? I went home and told my wife, and she was quite keen on it. So I applied for it, and the honest truth, I later on got the straight goods. Nobody else applied for it. You don't gain prestige in the academic world for any knowledge of Israel. I became quite a zealous advocate of Israel, but it happened by stages. My professional life continued more or less in the old line for a few years, and then I began to work the theme of Israel into my reading and particularly my writing. I am a Christian. I've been a Christian since I was a little boy, so I've been to Sunday school. I know the Old Testament and so on, and as I walked around in Jerusalem, the names would pop up on me and the associations. It was very, very keen with me. So I developed the theme of Christian Zionism. Christians who had worked on behalf of the establishment of the Jewish state. This is not a well-known theme. Among Christians, it's virtually unknown. There are some Jewish scholars who do know this, but the founders of Zionism, Herzl and Weizmann, they were very close friends of prominent Christians who regarded themselves as Christian Zionists. And it's safe to say that without their cooperation, the Zionist cause would never have been achieved. And they contributed to an understanding that the creation of a state of Israel made tremendous sense as the final chapter in the evolution of the Jewish people. But it also made an enormous sense as a liberal cause in the correct sense. People forget that Zionism was originally a liberal cause. The left has turned almost monolithically against Israel now. And that's because the values for which it stands are conservative values. You can't get much more conservative than exemplifying in the 20th century and now in the 21st century the values that are based upon the Bible. When I talk about Christians who supported Israel up to the end of the Second World War, we were talking mainly about liberal academics and people on the liberal side of politics. They saw Israel as an opportunity, as a kind of an adventure for creating a new state and making it a better state than other states. In other words, idealism. After a while, the academics turned against Israel, partly because Israel succeeded. Liberals need something to patronize. Life doesn't make sense to them unless they are reaching out and patting on the head elements that need them and respect them and will genuflect to them and the standards that they apply. Conservatives are not that kind of nature. They don't condescend. Generally, they don't, and certainly Jews do not condescend. Jews do not appreciate being condescended to, thank you. They know what they stand for, they know their values. So liberals find it difficult to find a place in the world of Judaism. I want to deal with a very powerful cliche that's around out there, that people of conservative theology like myself, and Christian organizations and churches who come from that theology are mean and miserable cusses, and they don't uphold, they don't contribute to the upbringing of the third world. This is utterly untrue. The statistics are overwhelming. Christian conservatives, mainly through parachurch organizations, not through the Presbyterian. The Presbyterians have a missionary budget. The other church has a missionary budget. The Anglicans have missionary budgets, and they're mean, and they're trivial. They're not really contributing mainly. But Christians who send their money in to TV evangelists who run missionary programs, that's where the action is. There's an organization in Toronto, probably well known to you, called Living Truth. They have an enormous missionary budget. They have an enormous range of missionary programs. By definition, a person who belongs to that church is a missionary, and he goes out and he preaches locally, and if he's got the courage for it, he goes to other countries and contributes. That's where the mission, that's where the work of change is happening in the church. It is not true that the mainline churches, the Methodists, the Anglicans and so on, are more philanthropic than the others. I don't intend to be mean. I'm not trying to undercut them. More power to their elbows. But they perpetrate this impression that they are active constantly, helping the poor. And conservatives are doing nothing. This is not true. The opposite is more likely to be true. I am the author now of 7 published books. The first 6 of them were what you call scholarly academic books. They were published by McGill-Queen's Press, published 2 of them. Another academic press in the United States pressed another 2. So they were all books directed to educated and academic audiences. As my mind turned more and more to Israel, I began to research the origins of Israel, the origins of Zionism, and eventually I collated this into my first book, The Politics of Christian Zionism. I wrote 2 more books that more or less continued that theme further on, describing the relation between Christian teachers and the Zionists. It's a really fascinating story, and not many people know it. Then as I got towards the end of my 6th book, and after all this experience in Israel, I really wanted to write a book in which I advocated for Israel without apology. In other words, it would not pretend to be impassionate and scholarly. It would be an advocacy book. And I did, and I sent it to all the people who sent my previous books, and they weren't interested. Nobody was interested. Who needs a book? Who needs more books about Israel and Christians in Israel? He said, why don't you send it to Mantua Press? So I'm here to testify that Mantua Press is the place that will look at decent, honest, scholarly, grown-up books that everybody else rejects. But it came out of that utter frustration. I know many other authors of that kind who've just run into the wall. They write work of quality, some of it scholarly, but at least all of it well written. And the mainline publishers won't look at it. Literally will not look at it. The academic publishers will not look at it. The presses like the Mantua Press and those smaller presses that are, to my mind, part of that parachurch that I talked about. All the action within the world Christian community that amounts to anything, that accomplishes anything, it takes place around the church, not within the church. Christians outside their identities as Presbyterians, Anglicans, Roman Catholics, whatever, belong to organizations that support a great range of causes that the mainline churches are embarrassed about. I think there's increasing respect for conservative authors. The mere fact that the doors are slammed in their face by the general publishers draws attention to the fact that they have something possibly worth saying. My experience of frustration with the mainline churches and their publishers and the publishing work in general has caused me to seek out other places to publish my ideas. Now, I'm not alone in this. And there are websites that will publish materials that you cannot get onto other mainline websites. There is, for instance, in Toronto, a theological college, a small theological college called Tyndale College. A big conservative boom, I think, is on the horizon.
Professor Salim Mansur has authored Delectable Lie, A Liberal Repudiation of Multiculturalism, and The Quran Problem and Islamism, Reflections of a Dissident Muslim. He has engaged in the critique of political Islam or Islamism from the perspective of a classical liberalism, and he has also applied the principles of classical liberalism in repudiating multiculturalism as a delectable lie.
My name is Salim Mansur, and I'm the author of two of Mantua books. I teach at Western University in London, Ontario, in the Department of Political Science. My area of focus is comparative politics and comparative development. Well, first of all, we have to understand that Islamism is a perversion of Islam. Religion is not politics, but when religion is made into politics, then it is nothing but inquisition. When it is politicized, political Islam or Islamism, then it becomes a political instrument in the hands of those who hold power, and how they then use the instrument for their own purpose, that is to justify their own actions. But whatever it is not Islam. It is using Islam to legitimize or to give it the aura of that they are following a religious argument and they're implementing a religious value system. The question about the liberal left and their support for Muslims or those who are Islamists, who are in a sense engaged in pursuing their political interests, but in the name of Islam, why have they done this, or why do they do this? First of all, they don't understand the difference themselves. They're historically ignorant, misinformed in general. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, they seek to identify and support Muslims on the basis that Muslims are the victims, because the Islamists project the argument that they are the victim. They are the victim of the modern world, of capitalism, of imperialism, of Americans, of British. And instinctively and reflexively, the left, and in this case the left liberals in the Western world, the Democratic Party, they have a preferred policy option or ideology that they are the party of the victim. They're going to defend the victim. They're going to correct the wrongs of history. And so when the Islamists present themselves as victims of history in which the West has been the dominant power and the victors and have dictated to the rest of the world in this presentation, then it is only natural from the point of view of the left that we will stand in solidarity with the Islamists, even though what the Islamists are pursuing is precisely everything that technically the liberal left presumably stand for. That is human rights, that is about equal rights of men and women, that's gender rights, that's defending the minorities. Well, the Islamists don't want any of those things. The Islamists want to construct a society in their own image, which is projecting back in time rather than looking at the present and into the future. Back in time, that is the pre-modern world. Fundamental idea of liberalism is the word liberty, that's freedom. The fundamental ideas of freedom is associated with the idea of the freedom of expression, the freedom of religion, the freedom of association. Religion in the sense, freedom to believe what you want to believe. That doesn't get in the way of anybody else, So these were the ideas over which the struggle took place in the West. The famous saying of Voltaire, I might disagree with you, but I will defend your right to express what you think. This is 17th, 18th century. The struggle for freedom led to the American Revolution, that is the freedom from the British Empire of a people who basically argued that you cannot tax me if I'm not represented. From that moment on, I mean, this idea became a social force of freedom. Now, in our time, in the West, particularly in North America, those ideas of freedom is more or less embodied by the Conservative Party in North America, the Conservative Party in Canada, or the Republican Party in the United States, as opposed to the Liberal Party or the Democratic Party, which technically should be the one that be defending these values, but they have shifted more and more towards collective or group interests. Well, I was born in Calcutta, India. My parents are of Indian origin. The majority population in India, Hindus, their ideas, their philosophy, their religious tradition goes back thousands of years. For instance, the Hindu religion is based on the principle of caste system. So you're not only born within Hinduism, you're also born within a particular caste definition. And so if you want to rebel against the requirements of that caste, if you want to break out of those strictures, then you will be in violation of the tradition and you will face some sort of penalty. But then under the British rule, the ideas of modern Enlightenment values that emerged in Europe came through to India. And so the contradiction, the Indian political system is based upon British values, British tradition. And so the struggle in India, the whole issue of women's rights, minority rights, individual rights, which are now reflected in the Indian Constitution as it is reflected in the Canadian Constitution, is a struggle, is a daily struggle. A good example, bringing it right into Canada, and in a very dramatic sense, because it was a dramatic issue. An Afghan family in Canada, in Mississauga. This young girl was either born in Canada or she had come at a very young age and was growing up in Canada. And so now she's a teenage young girl and she's going to a Canadian school, which is of course a gender mixed school, or boys and girls together go to school. It's not a separate education. And so she picks up all the things that a Canadian teenager lives by and accepts in terms of friendships and way of life and going about trying to do things. And so this young girl was doing what all her friends were doing, but that was not approved by her family, especially the male members of the family. And eventually the family heard that she had friends who were also boys or males, and that was seen as a violation of what is the traditional rights. Well, this young girl was forbidden to have relationship, and when she did not abide by those rules, eventually she was suffocated and killed. Her name was Aqsa Parvez. And the story captures, in essence, of the problems of multiculturalism. Because in this multicultural society in Canada that prides itself, that we have developed this notion of multiculturalism, all cultures are equal, and this is an advancement on our classical liberal values, we are such a tolerant society. Well, all the various institutions in the society where Aqsa Parvez was a child growing up, her school, her police force, the various political parties, the church groups, the mosque groups, everybody ignored the situation in which not only Aqsa Parvez was living, but young girls of others' families. And when she needed help, when she was in a desperate situation to be protected, the Canadian society failed her, that is, failed an individual by giving greater importance to the collective. That is the tradition of that family, of that culture. You see, all cultures are equal. All cultures are not equal. That's my fundamental point. a culture that sends man to the moon, and a culture that suffocates a young girl because that young girl had friends that were from the opposite sex, is not equal by no stretch of imagination. Whatever Pierre Elliott Trudeau said, or whatever Justin Trudeau says, or whoever says it. Well, ultimately, classical liberal values, to distinguish it with what has happened liberal left, classical liberal values is fundamentally based on the respect for tradition, history, that is articulated and lived by individuals. But I think that most of us who were attracted and eventually found home in Canada, whether we can articulate that consciously or whether we instinctively understand it, we, that is all of us who are Canadians, coming from different points and places in the world, we came here because we wanted to be free. We wanted to live the life according to the way we felt that we would fulfill our desires, our hopes of what we want to achieve and how we want to prosper, as opposed to the societies where we left, which were societies where you were under instruction by the weight of tradition and history, that you had to do what you were told to do, not what you wanted to do.